Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Unlock Market Access and Pricing Potential of an Orphan Drug, delivered by Global Pricing Innovations, or GPI. I'm Dr. Patty Peoples, president of the Peoples Collaborative. I'm a health economist and also serve as a strategic board advisor to GPI. I'm really glad that you're here today. You'll see that we are using the Zoom interface for today's webinar. You may use that chat button at the bottom to communicate with our technical team and to submit questions to our speakers. Today's session is going to be really interactive, and I really hope that you're going to engage with us with questions and comments. And our panelists are going to answer those throughout the presentation. All participants are going to receive an email straight after the webinar with relevant resources related to today's topic, including contact information for the speakers. Also included in that email is a link to a survey that takes just 60 seconds. The GPI team wants to deliver content that is meaningful and important to you, but we need your feedback via that survey to provide what is most relevant. Tomorrow, all participants will receive another email that will include access to the webinar recording and the presentation. Bottom line, watch your email. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers and panelists. Audience, please meet Kate Onstie, GPI Associate Director of Consulting. Kate, come on camera for us, please. Hi there. Kate's expertise lies within global market access and HEOR. She supports clients using both primary and secondary research to strengthen their brand strategies with evidence. She has broad therapeutic expertise, including in today's topic area, rare and orphan diseases, as well as vaccines, biosimilars, oncology, and immunology. And I see we've got an individual who jumped on. I believe that's you, Jamie. If you could disengage your speaker and hit your mute button. Thank you. I'd also like to introduce you to our second speaker, Rachel Zhao. She is head of product strategy at GPI. Rachel specializes in technology-driven solutions that drive efficiency and empower better and faster decision-making to the pharma industry. She leverages her expertise in market access, HEOR, and pricing, coupled with data analytics, and she works with a broad range of clients. Hi, Rachel. Hi, Kate. Let me set the stage, audience, to get us started. Today's topic of orphan drug pricing potential and market access, it's timely, and it's a challenge that's experienced by an increasing number of organizations today. In fact, 2022 may be hailed as a pivotal year for the diagnosis and treatment of rare diseases. Scientific advances and new approval pathways in certain regions have catalyzed market expansion with launches well beyond the oncology indications of yore. And we see a movement away from monopolies to a more competitive market with multiple products available within a single indication. Moreover, there are regional and country shifts that should be watched across the globe, such as, for example, the passage in the US of the Inflation Reduction Act, to name just one. And this could potentially be the beginning of pricing and subsequent patient access policies that could spread over to the orphan drug sector in time. As pharma manufacturers like you're seeing that previous orphan drug HTA decisions or payer research have limitations in informing pricing and access for the new compounds. And this has led companies to grapple with a pricing policy and a clinical development infrastructure that drives that important innovation while being thoughtful about pricing, coverage, and cumulative affordability to the health system. So today's webinar is going to break down these challenges and show you a new way to forecast future asset value and price for rare and orphan diseases using an innovative and an award-winning platform. So let's kick it off with a poll because I want to hear from you. Natasha, could you deploy that first poll, please? Audience, let us hear from you, please. Which component to launching an orphan drug do you find to be more of a challenge? Choose one. Is it market access? Is it pricing? Or is it both? I'm going to give you just a few seconds to drop your response in. All right, Natasha, if we've begun to get some responses in, let's click over to those results and see what it looks like. So really interesting. The two responses were pricing and both, while no one chose the market access. Kate, you're our first speaker. I'd love to toss it over to you and let you comment on these poll findings and then kick off your part of the presentation. Take it away.
Oh, that's great. I think it's really interesting that we have a lot of responses for pricing, but none for market access. I think one of the things from my experience with working in market access and pricing is that they are so heavily interlinked. You can't have pricing without the access decisions and the evidence related to those. And kind of vice versa, you can't have market access without negotiating a price. So I would say here that my answer would be both. And so I agree with the 57% that said that. But yeah, it's interesting that nobody chose for market access at all. Great. So let's get started. Before we take a deep dive into the market access and pricing of an orphan drug, I thought it'd be a good point to look at the orphan drug landscape. So orphan drugs account for a substantial proportion of recently approved and launched products. Here we have focused on Europe. And as you can see from the 3 launch markets in Europe, UK, France, and Germany, almost a third of products launched since 2016 were orphan products. This includes 11 cell and gene therapies. Now you'll see here that there may be some differences in the total number of products, and this is related to the price data availability from our GPI Pulse platform, our price and access analytics platform. Taking a deeper look at these data, it's interesting to see that most of the orphan products were approved in non-oncology indications since 2016. The most orphan products, 21 as per the chart on the right, were approved in 2018, of which 15 of these were for non-oncology indications. It looks like non-oncology indications will continue to dominate orphan products. So considering the orphan indications in more detail, interestingly, data of these approved products show there are several products available in one indication. Although the exact indication may differ slightly, such as the different types of seizures, it shows how competition is increasing. What is particularly surprising is that even non-oncology indications may have multiple products approved. So here you can see spinal muscular atrophy has the highest number of products. So if we're looking at the SMA landscape and how it was shaped, the initial introduction of Spinraza, which was an IV formulation, followed by Zolgensma, a cell and gene therapy, and then Evrysdi, an oral formulation. It's clear that second and third products, although different, would have faced increased competition for launch. This is not a unique example. So for some orphan indications, there are a lot of products in the pipeline, and it's likely that there will be increased competition for these products. For example, ALS is one rare disease where there are limited treatment options at the moment, but there are over 5 potential products available within the pipeline and due to launch over the next few years.
Kate, I have a question for you. I'm curious, with this increasing number of products within singular indications, that increasing competitive environment, how is that affecting the evidence requirements?
I think that's an interesting question. I think with all these products being orphan designated, I think it means that it's likely that they will be approved with more uncertain data. Now, one of the key things that manufacturers may need to consider in terms of ways to demonstrate benefit versus other potential pipeline products. So in addition to those clinical trials, some things like indirect treatment comparisons might be an option. And really, I think the key point to this is that manufacturers should be considering the potential competition as early as possible. And this will ensure this is included within the strategy. So this is kind of moving away from the sort of typical orphan maybe strategies previously and applying similar principles to non-orphan therapies.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Audience, what questions do you have? Please drop them into that chat or the Q&A, and we will address those throughout. Continue on, Kate.
Great. Thank you, Patty. So in addition to the potential competition, manufacturers face many uncertainties during the development of an orphan drug. Most challenging is obtaining return on investment. Manufacturing and development costs of orphan drugs is expensive. However, securing reimbursement and a premium price to recoup these costs is very uncertain. One of the main reasons for the high costs is that a lot of research and development is required to generate evidence of clinical benefit. Due to the rarity of diseases targeted by orphan drugs, global clinical trials may include multiple centres but recruit limited patients. This contributes to a small sample size with which to demonstrate statistical and clinical benefit and can lead to uncertainty in outcomes. Similarly, often the natural history of disease is not well understood. This makes it difficult for the manufacturer to demonstrate how their asset is disease modifying if little is known about how the disease progresses. Limited research and small population also impacts the clinical trial design. So novel endpoints are highly uncertain due to limited validation. Clinical trials are often a single-arm design with historic controls, but particularly in these diseases with a high unmet need, there may not be ethical to only treat part of the population. Again, cross-matching historical controls further increases the uncertainty in outcomes from the clinical trial.
Hey, a quick comment and maybe a question from me. I know that the FDA has recently acknowledged the difficulty for manufacturers, particularly with the choice of endpoints. And they recently launched the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot Program, which will really help to develop novel efficacy endpoints in rare disease drug development programs. And I was wondering your take on the impact of this program.
Really great question, Rachel. So I think the first thing to note is this is a US program. So the FDA have very different evidence for regulatory. They do accept single-arm placebo-controlled trials. They definitely will help to develop these endpoints, most certainly, but it may not be validated and accepted in the same way in other markets, such as Europe. So I think it will definitely be interesting to see if something similar is adopted or maybe utilized in a similar way by the EMA for those products.
Yeah, good point. I think this program runs to 2027, so it'll be interesting to see if a similar approach is taken in Europe as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rachel.
Kate, before you go on, we've got a question from Diego. Thank you, Diego, for chiming in. And the question is, how can we bridge that gap of lack of consensus on the appropriate endpoints?
Yeah, great question, Diego. So I think this is particularly difficult in orphan diseases where you've got limited data. Now, I'd say for things like this is where a consensus of experts is really important. So for the standard sort of approach for this would be research such as a Delphi panel is usually a really good way of gaining that consensus on endpoints. It's a method that has a gold standard and it is accepted. There's been a lot of research done in other orphan diseases where that consensus on endpoints, particularly through use of this method, has been applied. Great, thank you for the question. Excellent. So it's not just manufacturers that face challenges with orphan drug development. Payers also face difficulties when assessing orphan drugs. With the rising pressure for cost savings within healthcare systems, payers critically examine the drug prices alongside the level of patient access to ensure the appropriate balance is achieved. Many cost containment approaches may be negotiated, such as risk-sharing agreements or managed access programs, to name but a few. Payers are also faced with using the highly uncertain clinical evidence for decision-making. The lack of long-term data in a larger population can make these cost considerations beyond the few years of clinical data even more of a challenge for the cost-conscious payer. Although payers do take a critical approach to evidence and are keen to cut costs, they are aware that innovation is important to ensure that patients who currently have limited treatment options have access to the treatments that they need. Some markets value innovation more than others, with some markets even implementing specific innovative ratings as part of their HTA process.
That's really fascinating. Audience, let me hear from you one more time with poll number 2, if you would. Natasha, please deploy that. So we're picking up on what Kate's laid out here, looking at the challenges that manufacturers and payers face. Where do you think the greatest misalignment stems from? Choose one, audience. Is that price or clinical trial evidence? Where is the greatest misalignment that you think is occurring? Let's give you a few more seconds. All right, let's close that poll and see what you have to say. Strongly in the clinical trial evidence field, 8 out of 10, while 2 out of 10 are grappling with price in misalignment. Comments from the panelists on that?
That's really interesting. That's not what I would have expected. I think in terms of the insights we've heard, it seems that price is generally where the misalignment comes from, to do with that commercial viability. It's interesting the clinical trial evidence is something that's got such a misalignment on. I think I'd be interested to hear more about what that looks like specifically in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, the same here. Audience, drop your insights about that, why that's really a pain point and a challenge and misalignment for you. Drop that in the Q&A so we can understand a little bit more from your perspective. Okay.
Another interesting point is that the clinical trial evidence was noted by Kate as both a challenge for the payer and the manufacturer. So it's interesting that this is still a big point of misalignment between the two.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Kate. Great, thank you. So I think this does lead very nicely onto my next example, which demonstrates there has been an imbalance between commercial viability from manufacturers and price considerations of payers. So the most recent example of this misalignment is the case of Bluebird Bio and Zynteglo, so the one-time gene therapy treatment for beta thalassemia. So here, Bluebird Bio set their price at 1.8 million, but were unable to come to an agreement on its price with the GBA. And this has led to Bluebird Bio withdrawing Zynteglo from the whole European market, citing challenges to achieving appropriate value recognition and market access. It's likely that this decision is related to the global pricing implications. So if a lower price was negotiated in Germany. So as Germany is a heavily referenced market in terms of international reference pricing, it's likely this was a strategic decision for commercial viability. So Rachel, I know that recently you were involved in the cell and gene therapy webinar, and I just wondered if you had any specific insights on cell and gene therapies.
Sure, Kate. So one thing to note when we did this analysis on cell and gene therapies is that the average price payers accepted for orphan cell and gene therapies was actually way higher than for non-orphan cell and gene therapies, and that includes oncology ones as well. Just to give you an idea, the average price was over 1 million euros across France, Germany, Italy, and the UK for orphan cell and gene therapies. But for non-orphan, it was only up to an average of about 300,000 euros. So it's quite a big difference. And the reason why payers were able to accept higher prices were because of high R&D costs, little to no competition available, small population, and also high unmet need. And in addition, I think you alluded to this, Kate, some of the markets have the infrastructure to incorporate innovation in their HTA process. And this really benefits cell and gene therapies. So for example, France, Italy, the UK, but Germany, for example, does not consider innovation as much as it does the clinical evidence.
Great, thanks, Rachel. It does sound like cell and gene therapies are a very extreme example of the orphan drugs that we're talking about. It seems like there's a similar sort of processes in place, the innovation part, and a lot around the smaller populations as well, really driving that high cost.
Absolutely.
Great.
Before you go on, we've got a comment and a question from Jose. He notes that, by the way, in the LATAM area, the payers are asking local effective cost studies. Sometimes it is impossible to find this kind of data. They don't accept data from other countries. What is your experience with that?
Yeah, great question. So I know that payers do like everything to be from that country specifically. I think it's very difficult for payers to make decisions. So for example, if we're talking about the LATAM markets, but we're using data from France, how reflective is that data for that population? And I think that's really why they're asking those questions. I think if you were able to find a market where you were able to complete those studies or do a more global cost effectiveness analysis, maybe that would be something that would help support that as more supplementary. I don't think the payers are quite ready yet to go for a fully global perspective of modelling. They want to make sure it's all very reflective of the population and the market that they are looking at. Great. Thank you. Okay, so given the challenges that I've just laid out, and so particularly as the landscape moves towards these more personalised one-time treatment options, payers have tailored their approaches to HTA. So I'm just going to walk you through some of these for the first launch markets in Europe. So in France, manufacturers can apply for an early access authorization. Now, this was previously the ATU, but it has been expanded to cover non-orphan products. So as a general rule, products with an orphan designation are likely to meet the criteria for early access because there's no appropriate treatment option. They can't delay initiation of treatment, particularly if it's a really severe disease. There's presumed efficacy and safety based on the results of the clinical trials. And there's also presumed innovation, specifically compared to any clinically relevant comparators. So this early access via the early access authorization allows free pricing in a similar way to the ATU, but it has been adapted to meet the payer's cost containment. So with a payback scheme instead of based on actual revenues instead of those forecast. It also works for the manufacturer, allowing data collection as part of the scheme that can then be used to support the HTA submission. More market-specific evidence can be favourable when the clinical trial data is highly uncertain. Therefore, based on this new early access authorization for launch strategies of new assets, I think this early access authorization would make France a great first launch market. In the UK, a slightly different process is undertaken. So there's two processes. The highly specialized technology appraisal is an established process for orphan drugs that treat ultra-rare conditions. NICE acknowledged that these ultra-rare conditions have a small patient number and often a high cost, so include a higher ISA threshold of £100,000. Even if the orphan product exceeds this threshold, NICE apply an additional quality modifier to determine if the product could be considered cost-effective. I think it's also important to note here that regardless of this process, most orphan drugs have a simple discount or managed access agreement in place to reduce costs. For other orphan drugs that treat rare diseases, but not the very rare conditions, the standard technical appraisal approach is followed. This has potential disadvantages for high-cost drugs that exceed the £30,000 ISA threshold. However, the new adoption of the disease severity modifier could allow additional quality weighting to be applied for severe diseases, and this would align the two appraisal processes for all orphan drugs. However, how this is applied across orphan drugs is still within its infancy, but it's certainly one to watch as an opportunity for new orphan products. Finally, Germany has been a first launch market for many years. The free pricing period and automatic reimbursement at day of launch for orphan products is a great incentive for manufacturers. The assumption of additional benefit for orphan drugs allows the GBA to make reimbursement and price decisions on the likelihood and extent of benefit based on these uncertain clinical evidence. The difference with this process is that once the annual sales have exceeded a threshold, a full benefit assessment is triggered, which requires further evidence. For many years, this threshold has been 50 million euros, but as of 2023, this threshold is reducing to 20 million. Now, as these high-cost orphan products continue to launch, this could present a challenge where data remains highly uncertain. So therefore, for any of the launch strategies of new assets, I think that Germany may no longer be an optimal market for that first launch.
That's really fascinating, Kate. Tell me a little bit more. You've alluded at various points in your section about the impact of factoring in innovation. Of the markets that you've discussed so far with processes and policies for orphan drugs, how is that innovation being considered?
Great question, Patty. So I think one of the key things is that they all do consider innovation in different amounts. So, for example, Germany, they don't consider innovation. They focus on purely on clinical benefit. France look at it in terms of effective therapy, whether it's curative, the unmet need, and specifically if there's any additional value in sort of the type of formulation, mode of administration. And it's also considered as part of that early access authorization as well. Mm-hmm. Now in England, they look at innovation as part of the HST, so the highly specialized technology appraisal. It's also sometimes covered in the other technology appraisals, and it may become more common with the new reform. I know the new reform has particularly tried to focus on that innovative part of reimbursement.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Patty. So I'll now pass to Rachel to talk about how these challenges can be overcome and opportunities harnessed to support the value of an orphan drug.
Great, thank you, Kate. Now, based on what Kate has presented, we're going to summarize for you what this means from a business perspective. So we'll begin with 4 business challenges, give our recommendation for a solution, and also discuss the potential impact. So first we'll go through the challenges. The first one that we see quite often is that choosing analogs for your orphan product when there is no standard of care or recent comparable products. This makes it really difficult to do any benchmarking, and typically your competitors in the pipeline are also doing the same type of forecasting with the same challenges. Secondly, we see the difficulty in measuring commercial impact from qualitative payer insights. So for example, you may know from payer research that payers prefer a certain study design or a certain endpoint or sample size, but how do you communicate in cross-functional discussions the actual impact of a decision around these points? Then we have the challenge of evolving policies and payer landscapes. The current landscape that we're in now may not be reflective of the anticipated landscape at the time of launch. So for example, Kate spoke a lot about Germany and the changing thresholds. Perhaps, 5 years from now, orphan products may not have the same value or the same premium as they do at this point in time. So the strategy will be heavily impacted, and the assessment of your value of the product really needs to consider the future as well. And lastly, something we see quite often is the limitation in being able to weigh up several scenarios. We all know that the product's price forecast is based on many assumptions that change as the product develops. So what if the landscape shifts and you need to quickly test a slightly different TPP? How does that affect your position in the market? And what if you want to test more than the 2 to 3 scenarios that perhaps you've discussed with payers in primary research? Now, let's take a look at how GPI tackles these challenges. So first, with this lack of standard of care or relevant analogs, our recommended solution is to find a way to create flexibility to expand the analog selection to other therapy areas or other indications. And the way that we do this at GPI is to use a value-driven approach rather than traditional corridor methods. And this really allows you to move the focus of the conversation to value rather than just around the highest cost or the lowest cost or the average cost. It also provides a differentiated approach to your price analysis versus your competitors. It's a nice complement to the traditional methods or payer research you're already doing. And this could be particularly useful when the pool of payers is fairly small, as it often is in the orphan space, and you and your competitors are likely talking to the same experts. All right, so moving on to measuring commercial impact. Our approach to this is to quantify payer perception of value for all the various components that contribute to your asset's value in each market. So this creates a way for us to systematically assess an asset's position in the market and also define the levers that may increase the value of your product. And the impact of this type of approach is bringing that understanding and that discussion of value and commercial potential even earlier in clinical development. And it also helps create alignment around the strategic decisions surrounding evidence generation. Now, addressing the evolving payer landscape, at GPI, what we do is compare the value of an asset at this point in time versus the future landscape. And we do this using analytical models, and we adjust these models to represent the landscape we anticipate in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But what this allows us to do is to avoid surprises in what price is actually achievable before it's too late, and can also help with these investment decisions early on. And lastly, tackling multiple scenarios. So again, we use analytics and technology here at GPI to overcome this challenge. So instead of having to rush through a rapid payer project, payer research project, or having to do this assessment really rapidly internally, we use our predictive models to test these scenarios, and we can run multiple simultaneously. And the reason why we developed this, and really the impact, is to provide the ability to react quickly to landscape changes, shift your strategy quickly, and doing that supported with data-driven objective outputs. We also hope this will reduce the amount of time spent on payer research throughout the life cycle, allowing you to allocate the necessary funding and resources to payer research when the time is right. So to give you a more concrete view of how we apply our approaches, I'll now walk you through an example use case, which is representative of what we encounter quite often. So let's say you need to assess value and forecast the price for your new orphan product. It's a product that treats a rare pediatric bone disease. Your product has a unique mechanism of action. And there have been no recent launches in the indication and no similar analogs. Also, the estimated launch is 2027, which is 5 years from now, during which time a lot can change in terms of payer policy. So how can we use analytics and a data-driven approach to address this use case? So as I mentioned earlier, we take the approach of quantifying value in each market. So what does that mean? The way we do this is by breaking down all of the attributes of a product that could potentially contribute to the perceived value of that product in each country. So here we have an example of an orphan framework, which is broken up into 4 value domains: burden of disease, product characteristics, trial design, and clinical benefit. And within each of these value domains, we have 3 to 4 value attributes. So looking at things like severity of disease, are there any alternative treatments available? What's the formulation? Is it disease modifying? And also looking at study phase, study design, and also the efficacy and safety of the drug. Now, each of these value attributes may have varying levels of importance to different payers. And to reflect these differences, what we do is apply a market-specific weighting to each of these attributes. And this is something we've been researching at GPI over the last 4 years and have validated with payers as well. And what this framework allows us to do is create a numerical score for the value of your product and its analogs. So I just mentioned analogs. Back to the challenge of no available analogs. What we found is that taking this approach really gives us the flexibility to expand our analog pool to different indications. And that's because we're no longer just looking at the highest price or the lowest price. We're still looking at price, but from the perspective of value as perceived by each payer. So maybe the analogs are not an exact representation of your product, but perhaps they have similar attributes which make them appropriate to include in this approach. And we'll get to this more on the following slide. I just wanted to mention that during this webinar, we won't go too deep into the scoring methodology that we use, but if you are interested in finding out more, Kate and myself would be happy to spend some time with you to share more information about our approach. So we left off at this numerical value score. Once we have that numerical value score that represents the value of the product in each market, we can plot these value scores against price. So that's what we're showing here. We have value score on the x-axis and cost of treatment on the y-axis. And we use cost of treatment to get an indication level representation of cost. So using these analogs, we run a regression analysis to define the correlation between value and price. And what we can do now is score the value of your TPP and plot it onto the regression line to triangulate a forecasted price for your product. Now, the data that I'm showing here is an example from one of the retrospective tests that we've done using our models. And we do this quite often actually to ensure our models remain robust and are representative of each market and their policies. So in this case, we retrospectively tested the cost of Crysvita. And the accuracy showed a difference between -4% to 5% across the EU3.
That's really fascinating with the plus minus 4 to 5%, -4 to 5%. I'm really curious to learn a little bit more about that analog selection and that value-driven approach. Can you just delve into that a little bit more on the value-driven versus the quarter approach and how you chose those analogs for this analysis?
Yeah, sure. Kate, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, of course. So for this analysis, because a lot of this was around our research and development, we really wanted to try and see how we could push the testing on this. So what we were looking for is, you'll see here that Brineura is a high cost orphan drug across all markets. So we wanted to see how we could forecast that value and price using this methodology. We also included some lower cost products. So you'll see Namuscla across all markets is a very low price product. And so this provided us with a very broad selection of costs, but it also provided us with a broad selection of patient numbers. So within orphan drugs, patient number is really critical. It's something that informs a lot of decision making and is highly attributed towards costs. So here, this is why we've selected these products. A lot of these are from recent years. So again, most recent evidence to use to be able to look at those payer policies and to forecast this price here.
Thank you, Kate.
Perfect. So I'll just move on to the next slide here to delve into how we use technology to weigh up multiple scenarios. And here you'll see a screenshot from our platform, GPI Horizon. And within this tool, we've built the functionality for the price forecasting that we just demonstrated. But what we just demonstrated was looking at just one scenario. So within the tool, what we'll show you is how you can use technology to create dynamic scenario analyses. And I just listed here 3 types of scenarios that we often look at. So the first type of scenario is price type. So we can calculate cost of treatment using the launch price. We can calculate it using the current price. And this will, of course, affect the forecast. Then we have clinical evidence scenarios. So you may have a base case TPP, you may have an optimal case TPP, and anything in between. So these scenarios we can build into the platform as well. And then lastly, we have landscape changes. So we've touched on this quite a bit within the presentation, but it could be policy changes. It could be the competitive landscape. So this is just another example of the type of scenario we can build in the platform.
Rachel, in your experience, without a tool like this, what is the typical number or approach to running scenarios? And then with this approach, approximately how many scenarios are you finding that clients were able to run? What's sort of the before after kind of change that they're experiencing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, it varies across different clients. So some clients I've seen have the infrastructure internally to perhaps run some of these scenarios using bandwidth internally. And some clients sometimes struggle with the bandwidth to run multiple scenarios at once. But what I've seen typically in terms of payer research is that we will narrow down the scenarios to about 2 or 3 scenarios. Would you agree with that, Kate, when speaking to payers?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're a little bit limited there in terms of the insights you can get. So for example, a challenge we see a lot is we're halfway through the payer research and a client may say, actually, I want to test, this other TPP scenario, but it's a little bit too late because we're already halfway through interviewing those payers.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So that's a big reason why we wanted to build this into more of an analytical function.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Much more evergreen.
If I can add to that, Rachel, I think the key point around the payer research, as you touched on with the number of scenarios, I think really it's the amount of time you've got with a payer. If you had all day with a payer, you could talk to them about all the different scenarios, but usually we're limited to maybe an hour tops in terms of the actual length of an interview. There's only so much content you can get through in those interviews and making sure that the detail you're getting from those answers are really helping in terms of your insights.
Mm.
So that's why we usually have to use a smaller number of scenarios in this case.
Maud has a question. She notes the price obtained needs to be put in regards to the target population being reimbursed, capping, etc. How is your model considering that?
So all of our data within the Horizon model is based on the HTA evidence that we have. So it will be using those target populations that are from those documents itself, and that will be how it's considered. We also look at, when we're modeling, which I think Rachel will take you through in terms of price types, but one of the key things as well is looking at the reimbursement price, and that is one of our key price types, specifically Germany, where we have the data is available, and that is where that negotiated price is really important.
Thank you. Okay, carry on, Rachel.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll now take you through just a very quick demo of the platform. And again, happy to spend more time on this with anyone individually, but just wanted to give you a sense of how we approach this at GPI.
So here we have the Horizon platform, and what we'll do is walk you through how we use technology to approach scenario analysis using the 3 different scenario types we discussed. So the way that this page is configured, over here on the left, you'll see various projects that you have access to, and you can create additional projects as well for additional assets. For today's demonstration, I'll focus on this Orphan demo project. So once we click on Orphan demo, you'll see when this project was last edited, what therapy area or indication we're looking at. You'll also see a selection of scenarios. In this case, we have 2 preloaded, representing the TPP scenarios. And you'll also see the countries that are available here as well. So here we have the UK, Germany, and France. The first step of creating this forecast is project details, and we move along the different steps to eventually create the forecast. So here on project details, when you create a new project, you'll enter a project name. You'll be able to add additional collaborators who can read and edit this project. You can also add some additional information about the aim of this project and a description of the scenarios as well. You'll also see the markets that are included in this project, as well as some time stamping. And then down here in this next widget, you'll see project files. So this is where you can upload files that are relevant to this project. Our consulting team can also upload files, for example, an executive summary deck that's related to this project. So moving to the asset TPP, once we have our project details defined, this is where you'll see all of the value attributes that we discussed earlier within the Orphan framework. And they're broken up into these value domains. So first we have burden of disease. You'll see the attributes within that domain. Then we move on to clinical benefit, and you'll notice that there's separate clinical benefit attributes for each country as the evidence may differ. Then we have some country-specific attributes like HST appraisal in England or the CEA threshold. And in France, we look at public health impact. Then we move into product characteristics. So what's the formulation? Is there any additional staffing or infrastructure required? We also look at trial design. So the design of the study, the phase, appropriateness of comparator, and overall clinical uncertainty. So these attributes all contribute to the overall numerical value score of your TPP. And again, this is for scenario A, the base case. Then moving to the analog section, This is where you'll see all of the analogs available in the analysis, and you'll notice that these analogs are the same analogs from the forecast we showed in the slide deck. So in this table, you'll see the launch dates, the mechanism of action. You'll also see the cost of treatment. Now, this is where you can play with different price scenarios. Currently, we're looking at launch price. So this is cost of treatment calculated with the launch price. We also can switch to current price and see how that changes the cost of treatment. Then down here, you have more of a visual representation comparing cost of treatment across the different markets, different analogs, and you also see layered in here the reimbursement status. So green for reimbursed, orange for reimbursed with restrictions, and red for not recommended. Then down here you have some information about the launch dates in each country, and we hope to incorporate HTA decision dates here as well, so you have more of that timeline view. Now, moving to the forecast, this is where you'll see the results, and we're looking here at the UK for the asset Horizon 2. This is the forecasted price using those analogs and the price type that we've chosen. And here you'll see the value score as well. So one of the other ways you can use this tool to facilitate internal discussions, something that we hear a lot about, is the inclusion or exclusion of certain analogs. Now you may want to say, okay, well, what happens if we exclude a couple of these analogs? What does that do to our forecast? So I just removed 2 of the analogs here, and you can see how different the forecast looks, and also the price has changed as well. You can also reset this to bring you back to your full set of analogs. And you can do this across multiple countries. So Germany, same thing. You can deselect some of these analogs and see how that affects the price. So moving on to value assessment, this is where you can compare in a visual way what's really driving value across, or driving the difference in value, I should say, across these analogs. Now for Germany, a lot of that is in the burden of disease. Now let's look at what it might be in France or in the UK. So you can see in the UK, the picture is very different. It's still very much driven by burden of disease, but other attributes like trial design also contribute to the value score. So going back to that asset TPP, creating different scenarios there. Let's say perhaps the landscape has changed, or maybe some assumptions have changed in your TPP. You can then adjust some of these scores. So I'll just adjust severity of disease here, availability of alternatives for England, and I'll move over to my forecast and see how that affects the price. So just to give you a few examples of how we use this platform to dynamically test scenarios, but again, happy to spend more time with you if you'd like to learn more.
I'll turn it back over to Kate so we can wrap up with some key takeaways.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So in terms of the considerations to unlock value for your orphan asset, I think really there's 4 key takeaways on how to get value for an orphan drug. So I think firstly, it's to consider the future, payer value perception now versus time of launch, as we talked about, as the landscape within an indication may become more competitive, and as the payer landscape changes with more of these cost containment methods or benefits for innovation, understanding that future landscape and how this will impact an orphan asset is really important. I think the other thing is quantify the value. So being less reliant on qualitative methods will allow easy assessment of value in a methodical way to help to compare value of an asset particularly within a landscape with limited comparators and potential other pipeline products. Analog selection, careful selection of analogs that are not necessarily within the indication or have a similar indication by focusing on specific analog attributes that will help to demonstrate value. Finally, consider early access programs. So as seen particularly in France, that really supports that further data collection and supports that reimbursement success. Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. We've got a couple of more questions from our audience. So audience, first of all, you've got the contact information there before you. If you'd like to book a demo with Rachel and Kate, we'll also be including that information in our follow-up email to you. But let's take the last couple of minutes that we've got here to cover a few more questions from the audience. Diego Cortina has a question with respect to patient advocacy associations. Now, you talked about the policies in place at the time of reimbursement. What are your thoughts in regards to the role of patient associations in the decision-making process? Rare diseases are most of the time considered a strong unmet need for the patients.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. I think the HTA processes are considering patients more within their decision making. I think one of the examples of this is the new early access authorization in France. It's driven by patients. Patients have the opportunity to be involved in that process to suggest when a medicine should be involved in an early access authorization. For a long time, NICE have incorporated patient advocacy within their decision making as well. I think it really depends on the country in terms of their processes for what they're incorporating, but I definitely think it's some way to go. But patient advocacy is definitely being incorporated more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask it because it's in my mind. And this is a rapid fire response. Where do we have the most work to do in pricing? Rachel, let's start with you.
Ooh, rapid fire, pressure's on. Where do we have the most work to do in pricing? Well, I think it kind of ties back to our discussion around showing value. And I think this is something we've been talking about for a very long time now, but particularly in the orphan space, where there's not a lot of precedence in terms of pricing for particular indications. That's why we've gotten so creative with how we measure value and how we can incorporate more products to benchmark. So I think if we can come to a little bit more of a consensus or agreement in how we measure that between payers and manufacturers, I think that would help the pricing discussion quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Kate, your thoughts?
So I think this is around a bit of the holistic approach, making sure that everybody gets what they want from the end of it. I think we saw from the fact that the manufacturers and the payers don't necessarily see eye to eye, but when we start adding in sort of the patient advocacy side as well, we've got a lot of key players within this, and making everybody happy is very difficult. So I think there's got to be more alignment on realistically what's achievable. We talked about the uncertainty of evidence, and I think what can we be doing to really make sure that that evidence is suitable for everybody's needs, and making sure that it is demonstrating the clinical benefit of products to support that pricing. And I think ultimately it's all about the evidence that goes into it that really helps that price negotiation at the end to make sure that all of the key stakeholders are happy.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like most of the conversation today has really been focused on this eventual commercialization, but it strikes me listening to the presentation that the GPI Horizon could potentially be used as early go, no-go decisions. Are you seeing interest in using that platform for that sort of asset management?
Yes, definitely. I think with it, the rapid part, I think that's such a different to what we usually traditionally use in terms of payer research. For those no-go decisions. It needs to be something quick, and that's where I think the value is.
Yeah. Well, Rachel and Kate, thank you for a really informative and interactive discussion today. I have learned a lot, and I hope that our audience has too. They've stayed on for the whole hour. So I want to thank you, audience, for spending an hour with us today on the webinar, How to Unlock Market Access and Pricing Potential of an Orphan Drug, sponsored by GPI. We really appreciate your interaction. Remember to look at your email for a couple of ways to do some follow-up and to give us some feedback on where you would like to have further education. With that, I would like to thank you again and wish you a happy, healthy, and safe holiday season. Thank you and goodbye.